I'm going to share my screen with you here. Hopefully it works. It's been glitchy for me today, but you know, that's how it goes. All right, so for my dissertation, I'm going to be writing about queerness and family in the television show Schitt's Creek. And as part of my research, I looked at this episode called the M.V.P, which is about masculinity and sport, and just some of the themes within that. So to start off the day, just in case there are some of you that have never seen this show, and also just to give you a little idea of the premise of this show, I'm just going to show you the opening scene, which will show you what this is about. So enjoy. So there you get an idea of what he is like, what the show is like, what the thoughts about sport are like. In our culture, you know, really, this is what we expect from men in sport, right? We expect power, strength, confidence, competitiveness. We expect them to get hurt and to bleed and not care. And that's the way our culture looks at men in sport. But, you know, comedic texts like Schitt's Creek, they have the opportunity to look at these kinds of things with some irony and some humor to show that that's, you know, that's not the only kind of masculinity that can be shown in sport. Some of the scholars that I've looked at, you know, talk about, you know, the hegemonic definition of manhood is a man in power, a man with power, a man of power. You know, men, you know, are encouraged to think that, you know, male athletes, they're the social superiority, their physical, you know, identity as athletes. You know, men are, their masculinity is glorified, you know, the power and the strength and their height, you know, and men are encouraged that this is how they should be as men. And even if, you know, you're a man, but you're not an athlete, you still have to be victorious. Your team has to be victorious, that you expect your athletes to be. Sport isn't just simply a game. It's, you know, it's a way of life, and it's victory. It's how to be a man. And in popular culture, you know, there's images of, you know, what you're expected to be like, you know, and popular culture underscores that this is, you know, if you're a man, this is where you get your cues. This is how you are to look. This is how you are to behave. But now in Schitt's Creek, they kind of, you know, take the opportunity to show some of the ridiculousness of how that is. You know, people and men, they don't need to be cut from the same masculinity all the time. And the narrative, it pokes fun at traditional masculinity in the sport, and it highlights ways that people can be supportive of people with differing, you know, talent, different skills, different gender performance. You know, Lieberman here says, you know, that there are some women that are capable with the right amount of training to compete with men, and just as there are some men with the right amount of training who still couldn't, and David is one of those. He is unathletic and he knows it, and Patrick knows it too, but he's still, you know, he encourages him to be involved just, you know, so they can have the game, and he doesn't care that David can't play. He knows very well that David can't play, but wants him to be a part of it anyway. And Goffman here, Irving Goffman says, you know, that there's only one complete unblushing male in America. You know, it's someone who's young and married and white, heterosexual. You have to have a recent record in sports. And if you don't, then, you know, you're going to, you know, see yourself as unworthy or incomplete. But David is not like that. He very much knows who he is, and he doesn't care what anyone else thinks. He comes out in this uniform and shows Patrick and says, you know, I had this very cute, my boyfriend's on the baseball team spectator look picked out, you know, and now I have to wear this. And Patrick says, well, I think you look very cute. And of course, David's like, that's a given, you know. And also, you know, boys are taught, you know, they shouldn't act gay when they're playing sports. They have to prove that they're straight. You can't be suspected of being gay. But again, David has no qualms about that. He is who he is, and he always has been. And his dad knows that. His dad gets drafted to play on the opposite team, and he's just excited that they're going to be doing something together and having fun. He knows that David is not an athlete, but he thinks it's great that he's doing it anyway, and he's proud of him. despite all of that. And he even tells, Patrick very proudly that David holds the little league record for most times hit by a ball when he was young. And David says, that's assuming it wasn't intentional. They let me go home early. So there again, David is showing that he didn't care even when he was younger what people thought of him and his gender performance and his sexuality. Here, Patrick is trying to play catch with him and teach him some things, and he throws him a grounder, and David just looks at it and is like, can you just make it go in my glove the next time? He's not going to pretend, to be an athlete or to pretend that he cares about, doing a good job. This is Roland. He is on the other team, and he knows David. He knows he's not an athlete. He knows him as a person. And he, again, doesn't see him as somebody that shouldn't be playing. He sees him as an opponent, and he sees Johnny, warming up with him and says, it's not appropriate for you to do spring training with the enemy. And Johnny's like, he's not the enemy, he's my son. And Roland says, there are no sons in baseball, which of course is an allusion to A League of Their Own, in which the male coach tells the female players there's no crying in baseball. But again, Roland doesn't see him as someone who shouldn't be playing, but as a true opponent. David sees Patrick during the game playing out the typical masculine behavior. He's coaching, he's instructing. David does not like it. He's like, I don't know who this is, but can we put him back in the box? But he wants to win, Patrick does, and that's a very, typical, you might say a typical masculine aspect of sports, but a lot of athletes want to win. So, but Patrick wants to do so much that they get to the last inning, the last out, and David is up, and they have to score a goal. And Patrick is saying he wants to have a pinch hitter for him because we're trying to win here, And David's like, no, I'm doing it. Throw the thing, which is very funny, of course. And he hits it. And his dad is super excited, and the ball comes out to his dad, and his dad doesn't even notice because he's just cheering for his son. And he's like, that's my boy, that's my son, way to go, son. And David's running the bases, performing his gender the way he does, but everybody's cheering. His team's cheering, and Patrick yells at him to drop the bat because he doesn't know that. But, the other team's just worried about getting him out. No one's looking at him how he's playing the game. And then at the very end, Johnny finally throws the ball and hits David and knocks him across home plate. And the tables get turned. Patrick is suddenly not worried about winning. He's like, are you okay? But then David's like, did I do it? All of a sudden he is concerned about whether he was able to do it or not. So that's an interesting twist there. And Murray and White are saying, many athletes, don't care anymore about, trying to be overly aggressive or homophobic. It's more about playing the game. And in this episode, it's very much just about the game. Patrick and David, behave how they are, and everybody knows them. It is not an issue. They're just members of the team, no matter what David's athleticism is in this situation. After the game, Roland's upset because they lost, and Johnny is like, it's just a game, Roland. It was just for fun. And they're, again, in that way, performing a non-traditional kind of masculinity. And Patrick does apologize to David for getting overly competitive. And he says, but, I think maybe that's what inspired you to hit that ball. And of course, David's like, no, I was smelling the barbecue, wanted the game to be over. But so the messages that I found in this episode, David is a queer, non-traditionally masculine person. He does not apologize for who he is. He doesn't pretend to be an athlete. The team welcomes him, and he's the one that ends up hitting the winning home run. Patrick is gay man. He displays hegemonic masculinity in his appearance and his behavior, but then also, turns around, he's very kind to David, despite David's, non-athleticism. And he realizes kind of how he became negatively competitive. And so he sees that. And then Johnny is the straight man and a father. He defies traditional masculinity by, supporting his son, being proud of him, and also his view of the game as something that is just for fun. So this is something that popular culture can do for us, offers us images of how you could be masculine in a different way from your hegemonic masculinity in sport. And popular culture can, give us a space to see our society through irony and humor, and show that hegemonic masculinity doesn't have to be the kind of behavior that is expected of men in sport all the time. So it can be a teaching tool for us. So those are my, we're excited, and that is it for me. So that's it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Judy. That was great. Makes me really want to watch Schitt's Creek now.
It's so good. It's so good. And you'll hear more a little later from Jinx. So
yes. Up next on our schedule, we have Dylan. Are you ready to go?
I believe so.
Okay, sounds great. Then whenever you're ready, I'll be holding up 5 for when you have 5 minutes left and 1 for 1 minute left in time.
Okay. Oop. If I can figure out how to use PowerPoint anyway.
Yeah, just hit the share, Dylan. If you hit share, then it'll make it big. There you go.
Wonderful. Okay. So my presentation is on hegemonic gender in Amazon's The Tick, which originally came out in 2016. I have never felt less useful with technology than since I have started teaching. Okay. So where once the stereotype of the superhero fan might have been like the ostracized nerd dreaming of commanding the respect of his favorite heroes, the power and respect that his favorite hero has anyway, there's no denying that the superhero genre is now mainstream. Marvel Comics films have dominated the film market since the release of Iron Man in 2009, which led to a 10-year run of box office hits, including the highest grossing film of all time to date, Avengers Endgame. Their streak of highest grossing superhero movies was broken last year by Sonic the Hedgehog due to circumstances beyond their control. But I'm sure that they will reclaim that title again, probably this year. This boom of mainstream theatrical adaptations of comic book stories, now including a DC Comics extended universe alongside Marvel and more independent projects, has brought with it a new crop of superhero parody and works that attempt to deconstruct the genre from the more comedic to the dark and edgy. Even mainstream superheroes movies now like to pay homage to the audience's knowledge of the tropes that they're employing. They'll give a little wink and nod to the viewer to show that they know that they're doing a parody, or that this is a parody, that this is something that people parody. And this blurs the lines a bit between the authentic and the ironic in the genre. But in my humble opinion, one of these texts stands head and shoulders above the rest in its thoughtful but loving examination of what it means to be a superhero, and that is The Tick. The Tick was created by Ben Edlund in 1986 when he was a teenager. The Tick's central characters, in Edlund's own words, are defined by their heroic aspirations in a world that's relentlessly mundane. He talks about how most superheroes have this rule of cool, where if they do something that could be cool, it will end up being cool. But in The Tick, they try to start the getaway vehicle and the car doesn't start. They fail to, the world is working against them and they are unable to be cool, but they still want to be heroes. Along with the original comic series, the titular Tick and his sidekick Arthur have appeared in 3 television shows, an animated series in the 1990s, a live action show on Fox in 2001, and our topic for the day, the second live action show, which appeared on Amazon Prime in 2016 and ended in 2018. Each iteration has evolved to match the topical issues and tropes of its contemporaries, because obviously superhero media looked very different in all three of these time periods. And that brings us to its most recent form, which is relatively grounded compared to the others, to engage more with the modern superhero movie. And it explores trauma, family, the mechanisms of fascism as it takes over government from the inside. And it also offers us its most nuanced take on the theme common not only in the extended universe of the Tick, but in superhero media at large, masculinity, and what it means to be a man. So as Dr. Jeffrey Browne of the Pop C department has said, classical comic book depictions of masculinity are perhaps the quintessential expression of our cultural beliefs about what it means to be a man. And the Tick purposefully engages with this hegemonic archetype of the Superman. It constructs the lead character in his image. He's a very default hero. His powers are invulnerability and super strength, nothing flashy, just these very basic, nondescript powers. His mission is a generic belief in justice and destiny and goodness, and he's unshakable in his drive to do that. He is muscular, physically imposing, and possesses what Edlund has called the booming voice of authority in all of his renditions. This collection of traits puts him in contrast with a lot of other parody heroes, particularly those in the comedy genre, who lean into mocking hegemonic paradigms through depictions of superheroes who lack either the physical prowess and or the moral fortitude of the archetypal superhero, right? They either fail to have the muscles or they fail to want to do the good, right? Right after Tick got canceled, The Boys came on, and that's a deconstruction of these tropes as well, because all of these superheroes are in the pocket of corporations. So they look like heroes, but they aren't heroes, right? Some are meant to look absurd in their attempts to replicate the superhero physique. Others look apart, they're unkind, sometimes both, but Tick does none of this, and he lives as a completely genuine reproduction of the of this Superman. He's a little goofy, but he's strong, and he's willing to fight for what he believes in. In doing this, he avoids the pitfalls of the commentary of a lot of these other works, which fail to decenter hegemony, because in their mockery, they ultimately reinforce the dominant messages of the mainstream superhero films. And instead, they end up validating that model of masculinity that they're superficially condemning. Instead, the Tick forces us to question the hegemonic archetype the eponymous hero seemingly represents in the most simple way possible, by not having the hero be a man at all. Tick in in season 1, episode 7, Tale from the Crypt, Tick is having a conversation with Dangerboat, who's an operating system and artificial intelligence in control of a technologically advanced boat that gains sentience sometime before the show begins. DB explains that he's a gay man to the Tick, and he says he knows he's a boat, but he identifies as a male boat. The Tick looks confused and responds like a mailbox. This conversation is interrupted by the plot progressing, and it's never elaborated on further, but this single line necessarily forces us to backtrack on a lot of the gendered assumptions that we make about Tick based on what we can see of him. If the Tick doesn't know what a gender is, how can he have one, assuming we're thinking of gender, as a non-essentialist construct? This particular iteration of Tick also resists the valorization of his masculinity through his amnesia. To draw from Dr. Browne again, superhero films demonstrate an almost obsessional preoccupation with origin stories. The moment that the regular man becomes the superhero is a ritualized presentation of masculinization. Tick goes through no such process. He appears fully formed in the life of his soon-to-be sidekick Arthur, with no memory of where he's come from or who he is, besides the complete certainty that he's the Tick, and that it's his job to defeat evil. While he's a likable character with a strong personality, this defaultness, the absent sense of a gender identity, and this lack of context for how he became who he is, makes him at least partially kind of an empty signifier for the concept of superheroes rather than a power fantasy, as a lot of heroes who have his same aesthetics tend to be. He's not completely empty of signification. He's always been played by white men, and you can't call that default or an empty signifier without reifying whiteness as a neutral racial identity, which is a Eurocentric assertion, which is not what I'm trying to say, nor I think is it what Ben Edlund's trying to say. Because gender is a deeply racialized construct, it centers whiteness. The hero's whiteness in his multiple portrayals is relevant to the way in which he functions to parody superhero hegemony. By containing nearly all constituent parts of the aesthetics of hegemonic masculinity, but nonetheless being a non-gendered subject by his own admission, the eponymous hero enters a liminal space that effectively challenges the viewer to reconsider the way that we read gender into a body. So who is a man in the world of the Tick? Well, his sidekick Arthur, for one. The first season serves as his origin story instead of Tick's, but he's not transformed like a Captain America or a Spider-Man. He doesn't become a muscular, like, hegemonic masculine man. Rather, his story is overcoming the trauma of his father's death and aiding in the defeat of the Terror, who's a sadistic, hammy-played Emperor Palpatine-esque old man evil figure. And he killed his father, and he is trying to destroy the city during the first season plot. And Arthur thwarts him, and he's the only one who's believed he was alive the whole time. Arthur does not even gain superpowers through this process. In the second season, there's something called the category machine. It scores someone based on how strong their superpowers are. And most average people in the world get some level of superpower, even if they don't qualify as a hero. But Arthur gets nothing, flat zero, absolutely nothing. But Arthur is the one responsible for he's the heart of the team, right? He brings all these heroes together, maintains social ties between Tick and the other heroes in the universe who don't see eye to eye with how Tick wants to go about dealing out justice. But Arthur convinces them that they have to because it's the right thing to do. While this role is nothing like traditional heroes or even other heroes in this world, his form of manhood and his form of heroism is embraced and validated by the show and the characters. Most importantly, what it tells us about being a man is embodied in Danger Boat, who refuses to be liminal. He's an AI with a voice, so it's very easy to read him as a man, like we read Alexa's or Siri's. But Alexa's and Siri's are only a facsimile of a gender done for the benefit of an audience, and this is present in our minds when we think about her as gendered. But DB asserts that his gender is something he has chosen. It's not synthetic for the comfort of people. And it forces both those within the universe and those watching to contend with him on his own terms as he wants to be known. And on top of this, he chooses for himself gay masculinity, which further undermines any glorification of hegemonic masculinity. The juxtaposition of Danger Boat and the Tick in the mailbox scene, the Tick asks its viewers to think of gender in the tradition of social constructionism, joyfully embracing the tropes of superhero media while simultaneously critiquing the genre's limitations and challenging or subverting hegemonic concepts of masculinity. Whereas many superhero parodies err on the side of dark, edgy, mean-spirited humor, which oftentimes reinforces the worst chauvinistic aspects they ostensibly claim to subvert, Edlund's characters exist in a world that unironically tells the audience that love is the answer. Hegemonic gender is at odds with this world, and so Tick untangles the superhero archetype from normative masculinities and manhood, and Arthur, the true heart of the show, offers a new look at what a heroic man can be. In summary, please watch The Tick. It's very good. The end. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dylan. That was great. That show has been on my watch list, and this is now like bumping it up a little bit. Next, we have Jinx. So whenever you're ready, feel free to start sharing your screen and getting on with it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Give me 1 second. I also am for some reason, less tech savvy at BGSU than anywhere else. To reconfigure the desktop. Okay, can you see the slide? Yeah,
Yes.
Okay, great. So hi, I'll set a timer just so that if I don't miss, or if I don't see you holding up the card. Okay, so hi, I am Jinx, and I'm a first year PhD student in the School of Media and Communication here at BGSU. I'm studying the effects of representation in popular culture on in-group self-esteem and out-group prejudice reduction. But my topic today is actually something that I was looking at last year in my master's program in film and media studies at ASU. So I'm pretty excited to get to geek out over pop culture today before I go back to social science tomorrow. And I'm going to be talking about 2 television shows, The Magicians and Schitt's Creek. So thank you, Judy, for totally setting that up. And how they chose to approach queer representation. Specifically, I'll be focused on how the show creators approach the ideas of queer utopia and the ways they chose to represent that through their characters, and then how it impacted fans' understanding of those characters. And it feels a little weird to give a spoiler warning for shows that aired their final episodes last April, but just to be safe, I'll go ahead and give one anyway. This talk contains lots of spoilers for The Magicians and Schitt's Creek. So let's go ahead and start with The Magicians. This is a fantasy show that aired on Sci-Fi for 5 seasons, and it was based on a book series by Lev Grossman. The logline was Harry Potter for grown-ups, and it was set at a graduate school of magic. I would say it was more like Harry Potter meets The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and it's really not at all subtle about those influences. The grad students learn magic at Breakbills University, and then they also travel through various portals to visit Fillory, a magical Narnia-like place where they become kings and queens, fight to defend themselves from various forms of evil in a world populated by talking animals. Like I said, not subtle. But when Sarah Gamble and John McNamara, the showrunners and co-creators, adapted the books to make the first show, they tried to update things to make it a little more diverse, because the books themselves were very sit, het, white dude kind of thing. After the first season, they started to stray quite a bit from the books, and one of the areas in which this happened was with queer representation. By the end of the series, it was considered one of the queerest shows on TV. And Sarah Gamble is on record as saying she wanted the show to be a utopia where queerness and fluid sexuality were so normal they didn't need to be named or explained, because that's how her queer friends lived their lives, is what she said. So I'm going to start with a very high-level rundown of the characters depicted who have any kind of queer sexual orientation or behavior. It's not very well defined because she was really against labels, but if you need any more information about these characters, feel free to contact me later to geek out all over the place. So there are a few main characters and a few supporting characters. So I'm going to start with Elliot. He is the epitome of high camp as far as queer male characters go. He is primarily gay, but he also has sex with a woman when he is required to marry her for the kingdom, and he has to give up all other sex. He's had a thing for Quentin, this guy here, since they met, and has frequently made that clear through affectionate little touches, innuendos, jokes, and actual requests for affection. But Quentin is actually primarily straight, although he does engage in various activities twice with Elliot, mainly because he's drunk. But once there's a woman on the scene, he goes ahead and marries her, has a kid. So sorry, Elliot. Though Gamble says Quentin is now canonically bisexual, which the fandom definitely tried to embrace because everyone was shipping Quelliot. Quentin's words and touches of sexual interest throughout the show are reserved for female characters, primarily Alice and Julia. And it even shows up when they give us a peek into his sex dreams, which are all about women. He never once makes any sexual gestures towards any man or talks about being attracted to men. Quentin sacrifices his life at the end of season 4, just as Elliot is coming back to life. Margot is Elliot's best friend. She is another person who's primarily straight, but is kind of willing to cross the line if there's something in it for her. In this case, with a pirate king, she engages in some flirtation, but there's no real expectation that she's going to do anything about it because all she ever talks about is sex with men. As for the supporting characters, they really don't have great stories associated with them. We start with Marina in the upper left. She's a bisexual woman, but she gets killed off quite early, and she's generally selfish and evil. Kira is a disabled Black lesbian woman who offers up some wisdom and then dies to further the story of a white woman character. So that's a whole handful of bad tropes. Christopher Plover is a gay man, but he's also a creepy pedophile who abuses young boys and turns them into monsters. King Idri was married to a woman, but is now going to marry Elliot. But then this Black bisexual king is killed off screen by his sister. So you can see a pattern starting to happen here with her queer characters. There's more representation than most shows, but it's not actually that great. The Dark King here is the brother of the big evil beast. He almost has a fling with Elliot 300 years in the future. Again, this is fantasy, but he remains faithful to his boyfriend who's been dead for all of those centuries and who also he's willing to destroy the world to reunite with. And then finally, we have Charlton, who falls for Elliot in the last episode. But since he only actually existed in Elliot's head up until then, and then he takes form by inhabiting someone else's body, there's a lot to unpack there as well. So while there's a lot of sex and rotating partners and innuendos and sort of freewheeling fun times in The Magicians, ultimately there are issues with almost all of these representations. The lack of labels and discussion within the series also made it unclear which behaviors were actually tied to sexual desire versus more transactional reasons. And in the absence of that clarity, fans were left to speculate. The fandom was frequently divided on whether or not the show was a queer utopia as the founders intended, or if it was just a bastion of queer baiting. The showrunners did pay attention to this criticism from the fans, and there was definitely some retconning toward the end of the show to try to make Quentin and Elliot's relationship more than they had ever actually shown on the screen before Quentin was killed off. Overall, the decision to avoid labeling sexuality in the musicians mostly led to ambiguity and viewer confusion. In contrast, Schitt's Creek took a very different approach. So if anyone missed Judy's presentation a few minutes ago, the basic premise of Schitt's Creek is that a famously wealthy family, loses all their money and moves into a motel in a tiny town in rural Canada, where they are forced to get to know each other and themselves for the first time while interacting with a wide array of quirky locals. The show was created by Dan and Eugene Levy, father-son pair who also star in the show, and it ran for 6 seasons at the same time as The Magicians. So the mores of what was happening in society were basically the same. Like Sarah Gamble, Dan Levy, who is a gay man, made some very deliberate choices about how he wanted queerness to be portrayed in his fictional world, but his version of queer utopia got rid of homophobia rather than getting rid of labels, with the intent of showing how the world could be a kinder place and giving us something to aspire to. In Schitt's Creek, there are a few different approaches to identifying the sexuality of characters. So we're gonna do another quick rundown, but this time there's only 4 characters. So we're gonna start with David, who you've already met in the softball game. He is played by Dan Levy, the founder of the show. And like Ellie in The Magicians, David is portrayed as pretty high camp. So we assume he's gay from the beginning of the pilot. But in the last episode of season 1, David has sex with a woman named Stevie, undermining the assumptions that we've made about David based on his appearance and behaviors. When Stevie questions him the next day about his sexuality, because now she's confused too, they discuss it using types of wine as a metaphor: red, white, or rosé for male, female, and kind of everything else. David sums up his orientation by saying that he likes the wine, not the label. And Stevie, as well as the audience, understand the boundaries of David's sexuality. His romantic experiences include both men and women on the show after that, but after having this wine conversation, he really doesn't need to come back to discuss his sexuality again. After that, in another scene, David's father, Johnny, who you also saw in the softball skit, so we have all the same people here. David's father is talking with the mayor, and he explains that David is pansexual, and he uses that specific label. And he also describes exactly what that means using plain language. The juxtaposition of these 2 scenes allows viewers to reconceptualize David and better understand his approach to life overall, while his father's confusion without homophobia provides viewers with a model of how to accept your queer kids with unconditional love, even if you don't really understand their sex lives. Next is Patrick, who obviously is David's fiance and eventually husband. When we meet him at first, he thought he was straight, but then he realizes he's gay because he falls in love with David. And at the end of the series, they get married. Patrick's journey is explicitly discussed several times in the show. They acknowledge it's the first time he's kissed a man. He describes how he felt when he realized why he'd never felt right being engaged to a woman. And then when he finally comes out to his parents, that is shown as well. But otherwise, his and David's romance is mostly just that, a bunch of rom-com tropes strung together like any other show, and it's very normalized. So while they do take the time to give insight into Patrick's evolving understanding of his sexuality, the explanations are really just a small portion of the overall story with David. Even so, they help to explain to viewers what's going through his mind. And again, non-homophobic parents are given a nice model of what it looks like to unconditionally love your kids when they're different from you. Jake is a supporting character. He only appears a few times, but he's shown with men, women, and groups over the course of the show. He calls himself open-minded and has relationships with both David and Stevie, unsuccessfully tries to combine them into a throuple, and in later seasons also extends an invitation to Patrick for good measure. His reputation is that he'll basically have sex with anyone, though he doesn't specifically use a bisexual or pansexual label. So he remains moderately unlabeled, just open-minded. But it's not the most important part of his character anyway. Ultimately, when discussing Jake, David and Stevie focus on how self-centered he is rather than his sexual orientation. The last queer character in Schitt's Creek is Ronnie, who I love. She's coded as lesbian, but is never explicitly labeled, despite jokes alluding to the assumption that she is. Because like with David, we make some assumptions from the first time we meet her about who this person is based on her appearance and behaviors. In the final season, we get a glimpse into her life when she leaves a bar holding hands with a woman, and she makes a little comment about knowing a florist. Thank you, Haley. But Ronnie doesn't actually get the same exposition that the men do. She's also drawn with very broad stereotypical strokes of a butch lesbian. From her haircut to her cargo pants, her job as a contractor, the grumpy disposition, and the spot on the softball team. She also has a massive feud with Patrick, as was referenced in that skit. This is worth noting, though, because overall, Schitt's Creek does a really great job of moving us forward in terms of queer representation on TV. But with Ronnie, there isn't really any nuance. So compared to the unexpected discovery that David is pansexual rather than gay, against our initial assumptions, Ronnie's storylines are mostly asexual, and she kind of adheres to the butch stereotype throughout. We don't really ever see more to her. Now, we know that representation of marginalized groups doesn't happen overnight. What starts as no representation grows into stereotyped characters by people from outside the group. And typically we start seeing deeper character development and nuanced portrayals when members of the group gain positions behind the camera as writers or directors. And in this case, the portrayal of queer white men is handled lovingly and in detail by the queer white male creator. But the queer Black woman's story is more of a token than an attempt at, or a token attempt at inclusion than a nuanced portrayal. Still, even with this failing, I think Schitt's Creek does a great job to move the needle on representation. So, and I'm wrapping up. So we talked about magicians, Schitt's Creek, how each creator approached their idea of queer utopias. And while the concept embraced by the creators of the magicians of being in a world where the labels don't matter anymore is a nice idea, the fact is that we're not there yet. Just as claiming that we live in a post-racial world and don't need to acknowledge race anymore really just winds up erasing the lived experiences of Black people and other people of color, Sarah Gamble's approach from place of privilege fails to address the lived experience of queer people today. I mean, we're in a country where there is still legislation being passed to take away queer rights. And on a more mundane note, it just creates confusion and disagreement among viewers about character motivations, potentially causing less connection or empathy with the characters. But in Schitt's Creek, Levy's use of labels and descriptions helps to bring the audience closer to the characters, creates empathy, leading to more understanding and reducing prejudice. And ironically, it's probably the Schitt's Creek approach that's more likely to get us closer to the we don't need labels future that Gamble hopes that we will have. So thank you. The end.
Great, thank you, Jinx. That was very great. It's good, such a good panel. And then to round out our panel this morning, we have Anna, who, whenever you're ready, is going to talk about Wonder Woman.
Hello everyone, my name is Anna DeGalan. I'm a first-year PhD student in Media and Communication in the Media and Audiences track. Today I'm talking about Wonder Woman, so I'll pull that up for you now. Now please bear with me, I've already lost internet connection once and been kicked out, so if I do, please bear with me. I'll come back as soon as I can. But here today we're talking about Wonder Woman. So I'm looking specifically at Wonder Woman's musical themes. For those of you who are aware of my master's thesis, I looked at the superhero themes of Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. This was an add-on to my master's thesis. It was something I couldn't fit with the time frame that I had. And then I took a persuasion rhetoric course, and I wanted to combine those ideas. So instead of just looking at the musical text as it is and just kind of looking at how it fits within the genre, I'm looking at her music as a persuasive text and saying that the lyrics as well as the music side of it is telling you exactly what to think about this character. So specifically persuasion within Wonder Woman. Bear with me again, the slides I have are pretty wordy, just want to make sure I got everything covered. But we're looking at the producers, composers, and directors and how they're choosing their lyrical songs, in this case with the 1976 Wonder Woman intro that we're all kind of aware of, and the 2017 Wonder Woman Size To Be Human song, which is the credit scene or the credit song, as possible defamation or affirmation of her superheroine status. So we're looking at how persuading audiences that Wonder Woman is either able to be held at the same level of recognition and importance as a famous male DC Comics hero, such as Superman or Batman, using lyrics and their songs to help push them to that fame. Or we're asking the question of, persuading encoding methods persuading coding methods within musical themes Wonder Woman to show that she's not the same caliber as male superheroes. Does it help or does it hinder her? Likewise, is she in need of this added voice through the lyrics in the 1976 theme that it provided? Did it give her some sort of agency that the men did not necessarily need? So again, this was looking at a way to reaffirm her female identity within a male-dominated genre. Asking, are these drastically different results when it comes to gendered audiences and at different cultural eras, since they are several years apart within the two songs I'm looking at. So starting from Linda Carter to Gal Gadot. So if you're looking at the lyrics from the 1976 intro, we're seeing if they're encoded with persuasive messaging with Wonder Woman, and the answer is yes. And if so, which it is, how does it change with the introduction to Size To Be Human song that is now associated with the Amazonian princess? So how does it change, and what can we infer about this change? So I examined the word choice, symbolism of music, the style of the introduction theme, as well as the other song. I looked at musical scores, but I'm specifically looking at the encoded messaging of gender, assumptions of heroism and power, and how it has persuasive messaging that's changed over time. And then I looked at, did it change at all? And the answer is yes. So I have two themes for you. I'm going to actually have to stop share so I can share something else. Kind of weird how this works. So let me open it up real quick. So this is just, I'm going to play a quick 30-second clip of this one so you kind of know what it is. So this is the 1976 Wonder Woman theme. So you get the idea there. And then with my other one, sorry, I have to set it up. Okay, so the other one then, to kind of give you an idea of how it changed, this is the new theme. you get the idea. So those are the two types of themes that we see within Wonder Woman. So we have the 1976 theme that's very much what we expect from a 1970s style show, and then the more modernized song. And we're specifically looking at not just the styles of songs and how they change, but also the lyrical meaning and what it's trying to show with the hero from a persuasive perspective. All right. Next question is, I know you're going to ask, why am I looking at Wonder Woman? Well, besides the fact that we're looking at her because it was part of my master's thesis, I'm looking at her because she was the first major superheroine that was invented, right? She is one of the big three, as we call it, one of the DC Comics big superheroes, and she's the one that sets the standard. Likewise, she also has the most media appearances, which is what I want, because without the media, you can't hear the themes. So besides just her being there and being able to be looked at through a critical media lens, there's also been very little research done on superheroines because they're rarely shown on screen compared to their male counterparts. And I'm not just talking about looking at the character themselves, but specifically looking at their music themes. Wonder Woman has been looked through a critical lens multiple times in terms of her gender and sexuality and representation, but very rarely has she been compared with her musical themes and how this is being shown now on screen. So in television shows, movies, and animations, how is she depicted and also what themes are associated with her. My main constructs within this project were gender, sexism, feminism, and agency within persuasion of the superhero genre. My main research questions I wanted to ask when I had done my research was, why does Wonder Woman have lyrics, but male heroes like Batman and Superman do not? When we get to more Marvel, it's a little bit different because they have more associated themes, but DC Comics, and this is tied into masculinity, so thank you for bringing that up, several people, but they do not have lyrics, and I found that it's because they're not needed. A lot of the lyrics with the 1976 version of Wonder Woman is to explain her history and to explain what she fights for and what she stands for, versus heroes like Superman and Batman. We already kind of know what they're fighting for based off of cultural assumptions and so forth. I also looked at what is the messaging behind the use of lyrical meanings? Why exactly does she have it? Does it say she is like these other heroes, or does it say that she's different? What implications are they saying that they're different? So the 1970s thing was saying woman is equal to men, but sexy, right? She's more woman than she is wonder, was something I wrote in my master's thesis. She is definitely a heroine, but she's more, a female first. Versus the 2017's version is saying that Wonder Woman is finally different, or at least a different type of woman. Yes, she's a superhero, but at the same time, she's human, which is the entire point of the title, To Be Human. I also looked at these more minor questions I wanted to address. Character development has persuading the audience one way, from Linda Carter to Gal Gadot. How was the lyrics and also the style of music persuading audiences to take the character seriously? So more campy tone that you hear in 1976, which is also just a given of the genre and the time. But as it becomes more modern, we take her more seriously, especially when her lyrics and the themes associated with her adapt with the time. There's a message of integration as well as one of empowerment, I found. It was a question at first, but it's a little bit from integration to empowerment now, a changing of the narrative associated with her. Here is a depiction of one of the transcriptions of the score for the original 1976 theme I found. So I looked at scores as well as lyrics and looked at specifically not only how they change in terms of what we call musical semiotics, but also how the lyrics change themselves. The theories and methods I looked at, so Bixby is the effects and messaging features for content structure and style, mostly talking about messaging effects and persuasion. O'Keefe's persuasion, attitudes, and actions, and then also social judgment theory, but looked at ego involvement, intentional persuading through coding, and how basically to decode and encode messages for audiences. And of course, with encoding, you can't talk about it without mentioning Stuart Hall, who started it all. The 1976 themes findings. So when looking specifically at this one, I found similarly with Dr. Browne here at BGSU, he said in his book that lyrics allow for a marketing campaign to use her musical theme songs to promote the Amazon as a superhero, but as a sex appeal character, thus promoting Wonder Woman not only as a female superhero, but one that can kick butt and also look like a model, which helped because Linda Carter was a model and was in the Miss USA pageant and won. These lyrics paired with the visual iconography with the introduction shows off Wonder Woman, in this case Linda Carter, star-spangled costume of a leotard, satin tights, and mid-calf red boots, which suggests that the message of her looks is of equal importance, if not more, to that of her strength. Wonder Woman's 1976 lyrics are littered with metaphors and gendered language and encoding messages that explicitly suggest that Wonder Woman is to be considered both a strong action hero, but also a woman stepping into a man's world to stop the forces of evil with her powers of love. Make a hawk into a dove, stop a war of love. Like, that's one of the main lyrics of her theme. It's basically stating that through her passion and ability to love, something that more of the modern theme touches on, but it's introduced here. It implies that she's bringing an end to wars and establishing peace, but having an inner strength as a cultural theme with her. Versus a physical strength. But that's also mentioned within the next few lines, right? Stop a bullet cold, make the axes fold. A heroine with abilities to defend herself and knock out a few bad guys. In your satin tights, fighting for your rights for the old red, white, and blue, right? These are more gendered terms, talking about how she's strong, but also sexy, right? She'll kick butt, but she's gonna do it while looking great. Now we have the 2017 theme, To Be Human's Findings. In the 1976 version, the lyrics were trying to show how exceptional Wonder Woman is, someone who can be compared with other superhero greats. But now a more modern audience who's more familiar with her stories and origins, we want to see what makes her more human, which is something interesting because in this particular depiction, she's Amazonian and a demigod, which means being human is something she can never truly be. The persuasive messaging implies that Wonder Woman can express feelings of passion, vulnerability, and physical strength that not only make her a multi-dimensional character, but also shows the character development found to take place within the heroine across the film. This 17 themes are encoded with messages about power and feminism. So, to be human is to love is part of the main chorus. This is a metaphor likening humanity of love and passion as a theme that is often associated with Wonder Woman's sense of comic origins. Just because I predicted this doesn't make it any easier to live with, and what's the point of knowing if you can't change it? This is lyrics describing showing weakness and vulnerability and not being immune to emotion, right? And then last but not least, to be human is to love, even when it gets too much, I'm not ready to give up. Showing an emotional strength compared to just physical strength. These are my references throughout that I use. And of course, thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. Thank everyone on this panel. Now we have some time for any questions for our panelists. Feel free to unmute yourself to ask or type it in the chat.
Anna, this is Trinidad. I was just wondering, have you looked at comparing Wonder Woman, the 2017 one, with the male hero films of that time, like the silences within the score? Because it doesn't seem as though there's as much music running through the 2017 one in comparison to the other films that DC was doing that time.
I haven't looked at it specifically with that lens in mind, but I can. One of the things I noticed is that with Batman's new themes, particularly with the trilogies of Batman Begins, Dark Knight, and can't remember the last one. With those themes, they're more broken up and there is a lot more silence that's expected with it. And that goes with this idea of a deconstruction of theme that is tied with masculinity. And that's one of the things that I noticed a little bit more with Wonder Woman is there's less of that silence, but definitely more less of a very rigid theme that you would hear throughout a leitmotif. The leitmotif is more extended upon, or it's a variation upon that theme, which I think is more tied to the male heroes that you're hearing at the time. But specifically, I was more looking at why Wonder Woman still has lyrics versus why men do not. So if you see like the new Man of Steel movies or any of the new Batman movies, anything like that, Justice League, none of them have lyrics, but Wonder Woman still does. And I wanted to know specifically why. Does that help answer your question?
I was thinking of it. I was thinking of it what you were saying about the lyrics and stuff, but also like because it almost makes Wonder Woman sort of like a musical,
Yes.
where you have talking then singing then singing. No, well, so it was sort of related to what you were studying, but also thinking about like how Jenkins was also, her budget was vastly different from Snyder's, and how she might have had to just use the songs with lyrics, but no other music to sort of flow through, like some of the other films at that time. No, I didn't do it with I didn't think about it in terms of Dark Knight, but just more of her contemporaries at the exact same time. Thank you, though.
I have a question for the first three presentations, maybe also applicable to Anna, but I wrote it before Anna started talking. But it looks like maybe there's another question, and let's let Amanda ask first.
Sorry, I think Anna, she said her internet's unstable. So yeah, my question's for Jinx in the chat.
Okay, so yeah, the ambiguity, the labels lead to confusion. Do you think these labels need to be consistent throughout the series at this point in time? Do you mean consistent per character, or that they need to consistently label everyone, or that they need to constantly reiterate the labeling? Those
Yeah, I guess just all across the board, because you had mentioned that I think we're kind of not ready for this ambiguous label, if I'm understanding. So do you think that the viewership is not ready for?
Well, for example, there's kind of this idea with people who want to go beyond sort of, oh, let's have nuanced, deep representation of queer characters, you know, kind of that no representation, stereotyped representation. And then it kind of, before we get to sort of like just regular people with full lives, it's usually like all the problems associated with this aspect of my identity. So if we're talking about queer people, we're looking at coming out stories, we're looking at suicide attempts, we're looking at gay bashing, stuff like that. And so there's definitely a desire from creators to not want to focus on those things. And Sarah Gamble has said that I'm trying to subvert the tropes by killing off my white male lead, for example, who happens to have just been labeled bisexual. So then she's back into the bury your gays trope. But when Quentin has that experience, he doesn't need to have a big, huge coming out ceremony or go through a whole bunch of trauma. Like, he could just be like, oh, hey, I had sex with a dude and I kind of liked it. Like, even a one-line sort of confirmation that changed his perspective and how we were meant to think of him, because he is set up before, like, the entire first season, like, he is a hardcore straight white guy who is like super into women with big breasts. Like, that's kind of like his thing. So I don't think you need to keep labeling things, but I think when something changes, having just a mild acknowledgement of it makes a big difference in terms of allowing the audience to kind of update their understanding. And for you, Amanda, if you're thinking about like how memory works and how perception, updating our character model would be what's going on in the background. And yeah, so I think the labels are still useful, but I don't think they need to be, you know, kind of beaten over the head with them. I just think that when you avoid them altogether, there's so much ambiguity. If you're not sure what someone's motivation is, especially in the magicians, everyone's motivations are just like nuts all the time. So that's where I think it's useful.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you, Jinx.
Yeah.
Okay, I see Taufeeq's question in the, is that what you're going to say, Haley? Yeah, okay. Taufeeq is asking me if I, use the term queer for David and gay man for Patrick on purpose. And yes, I do. That is how Dan Levy himself talks about these characters. Patrick is, you know, he is attracted to men. That is what he is. And David, you know, as talked about, is pansexual. You know, he's attracted to whoever he just happens to be attracted to. So they do make a distinction in the show of that, of that difference. So does that answer your question, Tawfiq? Okay.
Maybe it's okay if I ask my question now. So as I was listening to the first three presenters, I noticed they were kind of thinking about how we represent the very like dynamic experience, right? To speak to lived experience of sex, gender, and sexuality. And I also kind of noticed that each of our three presenters, the first three, kind of felt like the show was right for you, right? That it had hit some piece of authentic, some part of like correct, some part of real. And I wondered why those representations felt right for you. Like what piece, if you really thought about it, made it feel relatable or normal or accessible, and where it didn't work, right? If there were moments, because shows are dynamic, right, where suddenly it didn't work anymore. You didn't feel represented, you didn't feel it was authentic anymore.
I'll pipe in. I think Schitt's Creek is just charming and engaging and a lovely sitcom full of heart. And so everyone just seems wonderful. And they have Dan Levy, who's is a gay man playing a queer character. The actor who plays Patrick Noah Reed is straight. So but he plays it believingly. Whereas in The Magicians, that relationship between Quentin and Elliot, I just never believed it because the actor, Jason Ralph, does not convincingly play queer or bisexual in any way to me, at least the way he played while he was in that show. Like all the interest he has in the female characters is broadcast on his face. It extends out through his body. When he's with Elliot, there will be like one moment of like a look of love, but they have this sort of loving relationship just as friends and brothers. So there's something about queer characters who are played by straight actors that it's a real thing. Most queer characters have been played by straight actors and we're used to those representations, but as more and more queer characters get roles, the differences in sort of putting that mantle on versus just drawing on your own experiences becomes more and more apparent. And Hale Appleman, who is actually gay in The Magicians, he plays Elliot. He is absolutely believable as a gay man who has some flamboyance going on. Jason Ralph just isn't. Doesn't mean I didn't love the show because fantasy's fun. It's an escape. But yeah, I pretty much always looked at those characters and thought, I don't really believe you're gay. I don't really believe you're queer. I don't believe you're going to sleep with that pirate king. I don't think you're going to do that. Like none of it just really ever played right. And I don't know if that's coming more from the writing or from the acting or both. Sarah Gamble has a complicated history of being accused of queer baiting on Supernatural, especially. And so Dylan is nodding her head. So like, yeah, that's a real thing. With The Magicians, there was this overwhelming like, oh, it's so queer. Great, Sarah Gamble learned. And then on reflection, people are like, oh, wait, maybe not actually as much as we kind of thought it was at first.
The Tick is a very earnest and authentic show all the way through. Like you can tell that its central conceit that love is the answer is pervasive and consistent. I wrote an article for fun about season 2 as a how to use love to combat fascism article that the creator actually talked about on Twitter and liked, which was very sweet. I do take some issues with Danger Boat as the exclusive representation of a gay character. I think he leans a little into a little too close to predatory gay because he gets a crush on Arthur and is like, oh, here, let me, like, he has like a shower in his boat form, and he's like, and Arthur's taking a shower, and he's like, here, let me wash you. And it's like a little weird. And it's not perfect by any means, but it does end with him being like, oh, I hope we can, you know, it's a whole big thing. But in the end, he's like, I hope I have to work on myself, and I want to be your friend. And he doesn't feel non-authentically gay, at least, nor even trans, as debatably not, he's only debatably trans, but since one imagines he was assigned kind of non-gender at artificial intelligence, I think he represents a transness of seeking out and creating your gender for yourself in a way that's unique to the trans experience. So he's not unproblematic. And I wish there would have been more gay content in the show, but it did get canceled after its second season, which was very tragic. So yeah, that's how I feel about the Tick.
Yeah, for me, Lita, I like what Jinx talked about Schitt's Creek. It is very charming. It's very funny. And from hearing Dan Levy interviewed, I mean, he's talked so much about how he wanted the environment of the show to be about non-judgmental love. And I think the reason that they don't use labels a lot is that they, you know, they want to normalize things, and that it's not always a question of, oh, what is this person's sexuality, but just, oh, here's this person. So it's not about, you know, always identifying these people by their sexuality or gender performance, but just who they are. And like Jinx talked about, you know, when they talked about that Jake guy, they didn't talk about him about his sexuality. It was just that he was self-centered. I mean, it, you know, and anybody can be self-centered. So I think that's why it really speaks to me, just that, you know, place of love and accepting everyone for who they are.
One more thing to add on the Schitt's Creek thing. I didn't mention it in this talk because I was trying to cut stuff out for time. But one of the things that's notable about Schitt's Creek is just the huge amount of fan mail they've gotten from parents of people who are queer, and how it basically changed their whole family, and from people who were able to use the show to come out to their family without recrimination, like in a huge way. Whereas if you look at the Magicians, the only person who tells those kinds of stories in interviews, oh, I got these letters from someone who said I could come out now. Hale Appleman's kind of the only one. So I think that says something. And with Schitt's Creek, that episode where they talk about the wine, and then his dad kind of defines what pansexuality is, the woman who plays Stevie, the one who's asking him, you know, what's your deal? She actually has said that episode kind of sent her on a journey of realizing that, oh, actually, I think I'm pansexual, and, you know, I'm open to everything, and I'm not the person I thought I was, because I had just never actually heard anything described that way before. So I think it serves so many purposes to do that for audiences.
Could I ask a question?
If you took it off mute.
Yeah, I think I'm off mute.
Yes, we can hear you, Jeremy. You can ask.
Yeah. I admit to some frustration here. Those who have taken my and Esther's Theory and Methods class, we read something about Star Trek in the 90s on a similar topic to this panel, this sort of ongoing game that producers play with queer audiences. Are they or aren't they? And, you know, what the Magicians is doing is not all that different. What's changed is society, right? The social context for these shows. And that is the question that cannot totally be addressed by textual analysis, is what is the social context for these cultural forms? The context, the lived experience of being queer in America has changed drastically since the 1990s. One thing I found quite dramatically had changed when I taught football players a few years ago. I expected a whole lot of macho aggression and homophobia and chest beating, and found very little of that. I found some, but far less than what I had expected. A lot of it was, a lot of their values were around the love of the game and athletic competition, but there was a lot less of the other stuff and a lot of the opposite, right? The millennials and Generation Z are the first really non-homophobic generations we've had compared to what came before. And I thought this was a, extremely dramatic transformation. And I always attributed that to the changing popular culture landscape. But whenever I suggested this, there have always been people who have said, well, no, that couldn't just be that. It had to be the changing laws. It had to be, social ways that were transformed some other way. How do we demonstrate that there has been a social impact from all these representations, particularly when they can be quite contradictory and ambivalent in their representations and in their effects?
The answer is social science. There are lots of studies that actually show.
Is that?
Yeah, but lots of studies. It's actually one of the things I've been researching for the last semester and a half, over the past 10 or 15 years, especially, but looking at parasocial contact with queer characters, also with members of other marginalized groups, obviously. But yeah, basically the findings are that seeing positive representations on screen over time, people build these parasocial relationships with these characters. And like, if you expose them over a period of time, prejudice levels go down. They are more interested in justice for members of those groups. So like one study didn't just say, what are your opinions on, gay people or trans people or whatever, but also like, okay, so imagine that you're on a jury and here's a crime. What kind of sentencing do you want to give the person? And they give you a few different cases. And one of them is like gay bashing. Mm-hmm. And they found that people who watched these shows wanted much more significant penalties for people who committed hate crimes against queer people. Interestingly, they're now also starting to do studies comparing the sort of appointment old school viewing versus binge watching. And unfortunately, what they're seeing is that binge watching has similar effect at the time you watch it, but it doesn't last the way the appointment viewing did, because the way your brain kind of lays down neural pathways, seeing something every week and thinking about it in between episodes and talking about it with your friends creates just a longer lasting effect than watching it all in a weekend and then forgetting about it again until next year. But yeah, there are tons of studies, and I would be happy to send you some if you're interested.
Sure.
I want to add on to that too, is I actually created a database last semester of popular culture involving people in the LGBTQ+ community, because we don't hear about it as much, and it's hard to find popular culture texts that have positive representation of people in the community. So it was really interesting, and I put that together, and I'll look up the link and I'll put it in the chat then if people are interested, because there's a lot out there that we just don't hear about in mainstream.
I think representation is a really complicated concept to approach, because a lot of times something that ostensibly can look like positive representation can also be at the same time reinforcing things that are, stereotypes, obviously, or misinterpretations of identities, particularly when it comes to like trans people. A lot of the time, the way they have characters speak on that in media is not authentic to what trans people would say about themselves. There's a lot of like, oh, well, I used to be dead name and now I'm this person, or like I was just complaining about this in chat vis-a-vis the wine scene from Schitt's Creek, where it's like trans people some of them think of their pre-transition self as a separate person from themselves, but a lot of times trans people are like, I've always been, a woman, a man, and a non-binary person. Like, I just didn't know that I was, but that doesn't mean that I wasn't. And that can feed into a lot of like, oh, well, trans women are still like socialized male, so they're still a threat to women. Like, it can immediately lead right down that track of like, it's a less authentic experience of that gender because they weren't that. So representation is on its own even when it is a hero character, is still not necessarily going to be a helpful thing.
Yeah.
It really depends.
No, I wanted to say when I was listening to Jinx, like, how much does it matter that the individuals that you are like taking this polling data from, right, for the juries, can connect the shows they're watching to people in their real life, right? And I think like that would be a data point that I would think matters, because it's not the show is like showing you a portal into like a real queer experience and it's the only queer experience you've ever seen, but rather I think that the show's more accurate, more dynamic, more subtle experiences are helping you to better understand and see the world that you're living in, to have language and have conversations and humanize and appreciate differently the people that you know, perhaps. And that like this is a piece of what makes the show able to do what it's able to do. I wonder for the audience members, right? That representation is being able to make that connection across. I don't know.
It depends on the study. There's a pretty wide range of how rigorous studies are based on how much money they have and how many participants they can get, because the more criteria you judge against, the more participants you need to have a valid sample, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, no, there are a bunch that do ask, like, you know, not only have you seen the show before, but also like, do you have people from this in-group in your life who are, you know, family, friends, acquaintances, no one, have I ever even seen a representation on TV? And so the more information you can get in the pretest, the more ways you can kind of slice the data later to see like, well, what are the things that actually make a big difference? So yeah, for me doing any kind of research, I don't just want to know if they've seen the show. I want to know if they have close friends or relatives that are queer or autistic or whatever characteristic we're looking at, because yeah, in theory, they're going to sort of bolster each other up, but not all studies do that, especially the ones that are smaller because they don't have enough money to really get a big sample, or they're just using college students.
Has anybody found any data on like queer people of color and how they kind of feel left out by all this queer whiteness that they can't, like they can sort of see the character, but it's not, it lacks stuff for them because a lot of the stuff I see still is very much steeped in whiteness.
And it depends on the studies. Every study seems to use a different set of scales, like how this makes you feel or how much you connect to the characters. They all try to have not just white participants. And then there are also studies that focus more on characters of color in general, or specifically Black characters. Those two sort of silos haven't really met in the middle yet. And again, I think it mostly has to do with funding and the way academia sort of convinces people that they need to do research based on money.
I mean, I think that is also an issue on race anyway, that most of the template for person of color is still Black, and Black people should have their own like kind of space as well. But then it's sort of like for everybody else, you just sort of are supposed to take what Black experience is and copy it onto yourself, which then is even more awkward.
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of studies on just representation of specific racial and ethnic groups. So not just Black people, but Latino people and Islamic people and just pretty much you name it, someone or some set of people have done a bunch of studies. For the queerness studies, honestly, they have mostly been done on shows that are mostly about white men. Anna and I were talking about this the other day, bisexuals and lesbians really just never appear. There's a lot of studies happening about trans people specifically, but there just still isn't a lot of TV that is full of queer characters of color, except for stuff that's come out quite recently. And so I would expect to start seeing more of that research, because basically it's all based on how long it takes them to do a plan, then conduct the research, then do the analysis after something has been out. So something like the L Word, Generation Q, we'll probably start seeing studies on that maybe in a year or two, I'm hoping.
Okay, hi guys, I'm gonna jump in real quick. Just kind of encourage you guys to maybe take this conversation, which is really great and fascinating, and I'm loving it, to the Padlet, or perhaps talk during kind of the lunch hour we have, so we can start kind of preparing a bit for our next panel, which is our keynote with Jeremy.